Hey, Andrew here. Today we're going to take a look at the top 5 loads for defensive use in 5.56 because people ask me, like all the time, what the best 5.56 or 223 defense ammo is. What we're going to do isn't necessarily exactly a type 5 these specific loads. It's going to be more of a top 5 kinds of loads for defensive use. But before we get into that, we want to talk a little bit about what we want in defensive ammunition. First, we want ammo that's going to be reliable. If it doesn't pop, it can't stop. The most important thing in any defensive ammunition, well, for that matter, probably any ammunition, is that it functions reliably. That means not just that the cap pops, but that the ammunition feeds and extracts reliably in your firearm. So no matter what somebody tells you you ought to run in your gun, you have to test it for yourself in your rifle to be sure that it's going to function properly when you need it most. The second most important thing is that ammunition has to penetrate deeply enough to reach vital organs. If you want to reliably stop people that are trying to do bad things, you need to reliably get deep enough to reach vital organs, even if you have to shoot diagonally through an arm as it's reaching out towards you, or if you have to fire from a supine position and your rounds impact the torso at an angle. In any of those less than ideal conditions, you want the ammunition to still be able to reach deeply enough to disrupt the vital organs. No matter how explodey a given type of ammunition is, it's not going to matter if it doesn't disrupt the internal organs, especially the heart, lungs, and major blood-bearing vessels of the thoracic cavity. And finally, yes, we want ammunition that expands and or fragments. We want it to expand and or fragment quickly. And we want it to cause a big, large disruption in the tissue or tissue simulant that we're testing it in. So reliable, penetrate deeply enough, and expand. In that order. And finally, and this is a distant third, fourth, we don't want it to overpenetrate. The myth of overpenetration or the concern about it is way oversold. To my knowledge, no private citizen has ever fired a round in justified use of force that has passed through a bad guy and then continued on to harm an uninvolved third party. It happens with police officers from time to time because they're far more likely to actually have to shoot people in crowded areas than private citizens are. But to my knowledge, no private citizen has ever had to shoot a bad guy and had that round travel through the bad guy and hurt somebody else. It just doesn't happen. So the concern about overpenetration is largely overstated, but it does mean that if a round passes through a bad guy, that it does have the potential to harm someone behind him. And it means that that round maybe could have done a little bit more work damaging organs inside of the bad guy instead of going on downrange and putting a hole in your neighbor's car. So all of those things together, what is the ammunition that's going to do the very best job for you? Starting the list at number 5 is going to be cheap Russian soft point. That's usually going to be 55 or 62 grain. In traditional Western copper jacketed ammunition, 55 grain soft point isn't always enough sectional density to get deep enough to reliably reach vital organs. But in the case of most of the Russian steel jacketed or bimetal jacketed stuff, it tends to get deep enough. That's with the soft point. Remember that Russian, or other for that matter, steel jacketed hollow point or full metal jacket, they tend not to fragment or expand or do much of anything. They just kind of yaw a bit, and that doesn't produce a very impressive wound channel. Now, there are some problems with the cheap Russian steel ammo. One is that their quality control is absolutely terrible. It sucks. The ammunition they produce just isn't very good, and it uses fairly dirty propellants that put a lot of carbon into your rifle, which means that it's slightly more likely to experience a stoppage in the same period of time without maintenance. And of course, the steel cases can also induce a stoppage. Now, if your rifle doesn't run steel case ammo, your rifle is broken. There's something wrong with it and it should run it. However, steel case ammo does tend to induce stoppages more often than brass cased ammo. Part of that has to do with the difference between elasticity in steel and brass, and how brass obturates more completely to the chamber. Obturate means how it forms under pressure to the chamber and creates a tighter seal, whereas the steel case allows a little bit more carbon to flow past the case, which can result in stuck cases. And of course, Russian ammo tends to be loaded at the very lower end of what can possibly cause an AR-15 to function. All of those things together mean that Russian ammo may be fun for the range, but probably one of the last things that you'd want to choose for defensive use. However, if you insist on using Russian ammo for defensive use, choose a 55 or 62 grain soft point. All right, number 4 on the list is going to be 55 grain full metal jacket. I know it doesn't sound very sexy, but it gets the job done. It does a really decent job at messing up tissue. Of course, the gold standard here is going to be Lake City M193, but a close competitor to all of that is going to be any of the M193 clones. In some ways, even better. Like Wolf Gold is essentially the same thing as M193. It is loaded to 5.56 specs, but most people report a little bit better accuracy out of Wolf Gold 55 grain full metal jacket than they get from Lake City M193. And of course, Pervy Partisan and IMI and a few other companies have what amount to M193 clones. Then in addition to that, there's a host of Western manufactured, brass cased, copper jacketed 55 grain full metal jacket, and most of those will actually do a pretty good job for defensive purposes. They'll have a relatively short neck, a decent sized temporary stretch cavity with lots of fragmentation, and they'll have adequate penetration. Those are all the things that we want to see in defensive ammunition. Is it as good as some of the better defense ammo? Well, maybe not, but it's actually doing a really good job, especially at close range. Close being dependent on your barrel length, therefore muzzle velocity, but at any distances that you're likely to be able to justify using a rifle in defense, most 55 grain full metal jacket is actually going to do a really good job. And any of the legitimate M193 or M193 clones are going to be moving fast enough that they can often defeat level 3 steel plates when fired from a 16-inch or longer barrel at 50 feet or less. Number 3 on the list, that's going to be almost any heavy OTM or boat tail hollow point. 75 or 77 grain match bullets often tend to perform really, really well terminally. We saw that fairly recently with the 77 grain IMI loaded with the 77 grain Sierra Match King. It was absolutely devastating from a terminal perspective. And there's a lot of other bullets that fall into this same sort of category, all of them sharing a fairly short neck, big, huge temporary stretch cavity, lots of fragmentation, more so than we see in 55 grain full metal jacket, and also decent penetration. And of course, the retained weight of the core is a little bit bigger than we see with that 55 grain full metal jacket. But there's always a but. Heavy OTM tends not to be barrier blind. If you want your bullets to have the same or close to the same effect after passing through a barrier such as sheetrock, car windshield, your television, and whatnot, heavy OTM is not going to be the best choice here. Also, some rifles can't stabilize heavy OTM. 1 in 9 twist barrels may or may not be able to stabilize 75 or 77 grain bullets adequately. The only way to know for sure is to fire some from your rifle at 100 yards and determine whether or not you're getting fairly decent groups. You may not actually see keyholes. It may be that your bullets are only being barely stabilized. If they are barely stabilized, they're not going to keyhole, but they are going to kind of open up a little bit as range increases, quite a bit more than if they were properly stabilized. To be sure that you can stabilize a heavy match bullet, you need a 1 in 8 or faster twist barrel. But in terms of terminal effect, they do a very good job, and barrier blindness and stabilization notwithstanding, there really isn't any other ammunition out there that can do more tissue disruption than a 77 grain OTM. Number 2 on the list is going to be solid copper hollow points. 50 to 70 grain, TSX, GMX, those sorts of bullets tend to mess things up real bad. And the lighter ones, like for example the 50 grain TSX, is moving fast enough that it can, like the M193, can defeat level 3 steel plates when it's fired from a 16-inch or longer barrel at 50 feet or less. Aside from armor performance, which may not feature super high on your list, they tend to be fairly barrier blind. They'll tend to perform pretty well even after passing through sheet metal or plywood or whatnot. And of course, they have a very short neck. Their expansion occurs almost instantly, and they produce a very large, dramatic temporary stretch cavity. One of the advantages is that they tend to have very high retained weight. That expanded bullet stays the same diameter, obviously, as all the way through the tissue track, so that when they come to a rest, they are cutting as large a permanent cavity as they did earlier in the track, where some of the other bullets that rely on fragmentation end up a really tiny piece that gets to that ultimate depth of penetration. With the solid copper bullets, you don't have that problem. They stay the same size and weight all the way through. Overall, they do everything really well. They tend to be fairly barrier blind. They tend to have a really big temporary stretch cavity. And although they don't perform quite as much tissue damage as a heavy OTM, it is really large. All things considered, they tend to be preferred over a heavy OTM, although that's mainly going to come down to where your priorities sit personally. So number 1 on the list is going to be medium weight bonded soft points, 62 to 65 grains. And a perfect example of that is going to be the FBI T3 that we tested recently. That's the 62 grain trophy bonded bear claw. But of course, there's lots of other bullets in this category that perform really well. 64 grain PowerPoint, 62 grain Fusion, they all have rapid, almost instant expansion, big, huge temporary stretch cavity, really high, almost 100% retained weight, large expansion, adequate penetration. Everything lines up just about perfectly. And to be honest, in these last 3 categories, the heavy OTM, the solid copper hollow points, and the bonded soft points, there isn't an objective winner. It really just comes down to what your barrel can stabilize and where your priorities lay. If barrier performance is important to you, then the bonded soft point or the copper hollow point are going to be better. If total tissue disruption is more important to you and barrier performance isn't as important, then you're going to have to go with the heavier OTMs. The difference between the solid copper hollow points and the bonded soft points is mostly going to be price, although generally speaking, the bonded soft points can tend to be a bit better on barrier performance. All of them, though, all 3 of those last 3 categories do very, very well, and there are a wide range of bullets that meet those. So the answer, ultimately, the answer to the best, absolute best load for you to use in your rifle for defense is M855A1. I'm kidding. As good as it is, it has great barrier performance, and of course it can perforate lots of different types of rifle-rated armor, and it's just insane in tissue. It's not widely available to the proletariat, so we have to confine ourselves to the stuff that I listed in my top 5. Ultimately, the answer is what's going to meet your price considerations, what's going to work in your rifle, and what's going to meet your priorities. If you have any questions, if you have some suggestions, if you're mad because I left your baby load off the list, definitely leave a comment below. And of course, head back over to ARFCOM, take a look at the thread in which we're discussing this, which we'll post in the description here. As always, like, share, and subscribe. Doing that sort of stuff, engaging with the video, even if you give it a thumbs down, tells YouTube the sort of stuff that you like to see, and it helps YouTube promote this content, which helps us bring you more content like this. As always, have a great day.